Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Another shot at forced regime change. That's what it looks like. As Syria continues to experience collapse, the neighborhood is not being spared. What was a tragic domestic civil war is now becoming a regional conflict. Again, the law of unintended consequences appears to be in play. To crosstalk the Syrian civil war, I'm joined by Flint Leverett in Washington. He is a professor of international relations at Penn State University and co-author of the book Going to Tehran: Why the United States Must Come to Terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Also in Washington, we have Matthew Feeney. He is an assistant editor at Reason 24/7. And in New York, we cross to Ed Hussein. He is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Flint, Libya imploded. Is Syria exploding and taking the neighborhood with it?
The risks of that are certainly increasing. I've been saying for it seems like 2 years now that the only way to stop the violence, to put a lid on this, is through diplomacy. Diplomacy aimed at a political settlement based on power sharing. The UN envoy, the Arab League envoy, Mr. Brahimi, is a potentially capable mediator for that kind of process. He initially resisted pressure to say that Assad had to go as the beginning of a political process, but he eventually succumbed to that pressure, and that's really reduced his potential effectiveness. Russia is trying to, stepping up its efforts to promote a political process. The Syrian government is ready to take part. Other important players, Iran, China, are backing a political process. But unfortunately, some of the supporters of the Syrian opposition, the United States, the Europeans, the Saudis, seem determined to intensify their armed support, their military support for the opposition. That's going to make it very hard to get Syria's diplomacy going, and it's going to keep the violence rolling along.
Ed, is it too late for diplomacy now?
No, not at all. We should give diplomacy every chance for as long as possible. And I think under the current circumstances,
but does the Syrian opposition want that?
Simply because
does the Syrian opposition want diplomacy?
We have the evidence to support the fact that Mu'adh al-Khatib has gone out of his way, has upset his own rank and file and his own followers to open negotiations with a butcherous regime in Damascus. There's no two ways about it that this is a regime that's killed its own people, maimed its own people, and despite the fact that the Syrian National Council and even the Free Syrian Army or elements within it and the al-Qaeda supporters inside the country that are, hell-bent on destroying the regime, Mu'adh al-Khatib has gone out of his way and repeatedly offered in the last 2 months, with US support, I hasten to add, an initiative that results in greater peace. What was Assad's response to that? President Assad demolished Mu'adh al-Khatib's family home in Damascus the day after Mu'adh al-Khatib made the offer for diplomacy and peace talks. So I don't think it's just the fault of the rebels here. I think it's important to realize that Bashar al-Assad and his supporters are not really in the business of peace, because they've got everything to lose and the opposition has everything to gain.
Okay, Matthew, does the opposition have peace in mind? You sound like a nasty lot to me, excuse me.
Sure. Well, I don't think all of them are a nasty lot, and I think most of the opposition, or a huge, significant amount of them, do want peace and want a transition that's going to be much less bloody than what it's been. My only concern with this political line is just as Ed was saying, there are al-Qaeda elements to the opposition, and who's going to be speaking for them after Assad is gone? It seems to me that it's going to be messy, whatever happens.
Flint, what do you think about that? I mean, are we supporting the right people, meaning the West supporting the right people in Syria? Or do we know?
Of course not. Of course not.
Well,
I mean, it's very, very clear. I mean, there's a long track record of U.S. and Western support for armed groups seeking to overthrow their government, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Libya, or now in Syria. And every time we have done this, it has generated massive civilian carnage and has produced serious blowback. oftentimes terrorist blowback against U.S. interests.
With respect,
but we just keep doing it.
You're pretending as though there's Western armed support. There is no armed support for the Syrian opposition. That's why we're in the mess that we're in, partly.
Who's giving them the arms? Where are the arms coming from?
Who's giving them the arms? Who's training them?
Just look at today's Times report. No. I mean, they seek almost 500 tons of arms a week. What they're getting is about 40 tons of arms. And those arms they're buying themselves with money that's coming from them, from individual donors in the Gulf. There is no state support either from the US or from the European Union or from Turkey or from Saudi Arabia in the sense of supporting them in the way the Libyan opposition was supported. The opposition wants that support.
The United States is stepping up what it calls non-lethal aid for them, and they're now getting involved in training. The U.S. is now getting involved in training.
Yeah, that's not armed support. That's not armed support, and that's not weaponry.
Okay, Matthew, jump in.
That's not weaponry.
Matthew, jump in.
You help others give weapons to the rebels, and then you train them to use them, and that's not armed support. That's really semantic nonsense.
No, the fact is they have no weapons from the West. You can't deny the facts. They're desperate for those weapons. They don't have those weapons.
Matthew, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think it's worth keeping in mind that John Kerry said recently that the U.S. would not be providing direct military support because he and I assume other American officials are concerned about where these weapons are going to end up. And I think it's also worth keeping in mind that Obama has changed his mind on this before, and that Petraeus, Clinton, Panetta were all apparently urging the president to back, with military aid, the Syrian opposition. And I think we can all, be thankful that the president decided to not do that, even though it seems now that aid is going to become a little more direct from the United States.
Flint, is this a good idea?
But if the United States is involved in helping others make decisions about to whom weapons will be given, and then the United States is involved in training rebel fighters in using those weapons, the United States is supporting an armed insurgency.
Fair point, Ed. Do you agree or disagree with that?
No, I think it's a black and white, very simple outlook. The fact is that the Syrian uprising was spontaneous, it was homegrown, it was native, it was not driven by the US. Syrian rebels came to the US for support, and again the fact is the US thus far has provided humanitarian aid, non-lethal support, and gone and given food and blankets, has not given the kind of weapons that Flint asserts, and poured fuel on a conflict. The US has tried repeatedly to rein in this conflict. The US is not involved in the kind of armed support that's being portrayed. We should be debating whether it should or shouldn't, but it seems to me that the fact that it's being portrayed that the US is already, it's a done deal somehow, that the US is providing arms, when it really isn't. I mean, there's no point in repeating this fact over and over again, that the rebels want arms from the US. The Turks, the Gulf allies the US has, want the US to support. And I say this on the basis of being in those countries on a regular basis, that the US gets this flack again and again, that why aren't you supporting the Syrian opposition? And the US isn't. That said, the Russians and the Iranians are actively supporting the regime. And there's an imbalance there, and it's worth addressing that imbalance rather than pretending that somehow the US is involved in arming the opposition when it blatantly, nakedly is not.
Matthew, you want to jump in?
But I agree that perhaps the discussion should be whether aid should be increased, even though I agree with Ed that I don't think the U.S. is providing direct military support to Assad's opposition. That said, I don't actually think it's worth actually providing aid to the opposition in that way, even with Iran and Russia's support for the Assad regime. But I don't know if Flint happens to agree with that or not.
Okay, Flint, go ahead, jump in.
Look, I think we may argue about how to parse various.
Let's stay with Flint. Go ahead, Flint.
We may argue about how to parse and interpret various channels, various levels, various modes of U.S. support for the opposition. But I think it is simply incontrovertible that the United States is supporting the opposition and wants to see it succeed in the project of overthrowing the Assad government. And as long as that is the U.S. position, and the U.S. is involved in whatever ways in supporting the opposition, the chances for getting a political process off the ground, which might actually produce a power-sharing agreement and end this conflict, are negligible.
Ed?
And that's really the only way out of this.
I think
the opposition can't win.
It's deadlock. Go ahead, Ed, jump in. Go ahead. Good point.
No, the opposition can, no, I'm sorry, forgive me. I think the opposition can win if the opposition was given the level of support that it required, whether it's anti-tank weaponry or whether it's anti-aircraft weaponry. Those are the two key forms of weaponry that the opposition has repeatedly demanded and not been given by the US.
You think that the opposition could win in the sense that it could take power from the Assad government and produce a coherent nationwide alternative?
Forgive me if I may, if the US wanted to remove Bashar al-Assad from power, it could do so within 24 hours. It has that level of military capability and superiority, and Assad knows it. The US's major concern, and I think the West's major concern, is what happens after Assad falls. And unless that question is answered, the US is, I think, the Obama administration rightly thinking twice about forcefully removing Assad. It can be done at the drop of a hat, but it hasn't been done for the reasons that need to be outlined. In other words, the sectarianism inside Syria, the infighting among the opposition.
Would you like to see the US do that?
Removing Assad.
Would you like to see the US do that in 24 hours?
No, it's not as simple as whether I would like it or not.
Well, you just said it was possible.
Does it create a better Syria with the forceful removal?
You just said it was.
Yes, but no, what's possible doesn't mean it's inevitable. No, possibility does not mean inevitability.
But should it be?
Possibility means it's an option that the US has and has not exercised. It should not be. No,
all right,
no,
gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short
it.
break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with our team. Okay, and does forced regime change ever work? Does it ever work out?
I think the recent history of forced regime changes, if we're looking at Iraq as an important case study, the answer is that forced regimes don't work out. And I think that lesson has been learned, and that's why there's a reluctance and a wisdom and a prudence on the part of the West to forcefully remove Assad. It can be done, but it has not been done, for the very reason that Iraq showed us, that there are tensions, sectarian, geographic, religious, economic, class,
just like Syria,
ethnic, that make it difficult.
You should probably be asking the.
Well, absolutely, yeah, exactly like Syria.
Well, you should probably be asking the people in Mali if actually Iraq is the most recent or best example of forced regime change. What we did in Libya certainly spilled over into Mali, and the French are trying to be French and other African forces are trying to deal with that. It's not as if that Iraq was the last time that the U.S. intervened militarily, and
Libya,
the results speak for themselves.
Libya is a good example. Flint, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I don't think forcible regime change works, and it doesn't matter whether it's done by massive and direct Western military intervention, invasion, and occupation, as in the case of Iraq, or if it's done, somewhat more standoffishly or indirectly by relying on local proxies and providing air support like we did in Libya, or if we're providing support for local proxies as we are in Syria. It doesn't work. It produces massive political carnage. It does not create stable political outcomes in its aftermath.
Ed, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general that's acceptable, but there are exceptional circumstances in which we should not go down the route of forever ruling out intervention in countries in which dictators are butchering their populations. If the population is homogenous, if there is a credible opposition in place, then intervention by the international community is necessary and warranted. And the UN, with the R2P, or the right to protect doctrine, gives that legal cover. But the most important point is the day after, and I think often we get the day after wrong, as we saw in the several examples that came up, be it Libya, be it Iraq, be it elsewhere. And the problem with the UN's doctrine of right to protect is there is no commitment then on the part of the global powers of the international community to nation build afterwards and to ensure law and order. And there is great enthusiasm here in the West to remove Bashar al-Assad, but there is, much like Iraq, no day-after plan, no coherence among the opposition, and sectarian tensions flaring up, a region that's unstable. And for those very reasons, I think the West, rightly thus far, has not intervened in the way that it could do.
Okay. Flint, who's driving this? Is it Saudi Arabia?
The responsibility
could you provide an example of a country that you think does meet these
Matthew, go ahead. Go ahead.
Could you perhaps outline a country you think that does meet those criteria for intervention? Is there a country that you would approve?
I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, I can't sort of identify a country, but I mean, one that does come to my mind if you know, if the Iranian dictatorship or the Iranian clerics were to unleash mass violence on the population in the way that the Syrians have. I think Iran's much more contained geographically than Syria is. Iran's population is much more homogeneous than the population in Syria is. If there was violence and if there were protests at the level that we're seeing in Syria, I think
Saudi Arabia is a dictatorship. Saudi Arabia is a dictatorship.
No, you asked for an example, and you know, on a theoretical level, but the reality on the ground is not that way inclined yet in Iran, and I think that's an important example. Saudi Arabia is different. Saudi Arabia's economic assets,
I think the idea
global
that
energy
Iran
supplies,
is a
sectarian
dictatorship
tensions,
without the majority support of its
of
population is absurd.
Flint, jump in.
I think the idea that Iran
the point
is,
was
it might be suitable for
and that was the
Western
point.
military
No, you're going under the individual example.
I want to go to Flint now. Go ahead, Flint.
I mean, the idea that the West should consider intervening in Iran if it, quote unquote, cracks down on its population, that it's this, you know, hated dictatorship that doesn't have the majority support of the Iranian population, is just absurd. There's absolutely no empirical data to support that proposition, and vast amounts of empirical data, polling studies and others that would say otherwise. The responsibility to protect doctrine does not supersede the basic stipulation of the UN Charter that countries can only use force in self-defense or when the Security Council has authorized it under a Chapter 7 resolution. Those are the requirements for the legitimate use of force. And the Security Council has not authorized it in Syria. It's not going to authorize it in Iran. And to try and use R2P, responsibility to protect, as a justification for doing this without the Security Council authorization makes a travesty of any notion of international law or order.
No, that wasn't my point. I think I think you fundamentally missed my point. The point is R2P on its own is not enough. R2P, without the commitment to nation build afterwards and without a commitment to put law and order in place, does not suffice for the purposes of protecting a population which is being butchered by a political force. That's the point. The point is not to use R2P and then, you know, intervene and invade countries. I think you completely missed the point that I'm trying to make.
Okay, Matthew, who's driving this? Is it the Saudis, the Gulf countries? I mean, because there is no U.S. national interest in Syria.
Well, no, it doesn't seem like there is, except, you know, obviously the fear that al-Qaeda could gain a bit of a foothold there. I mean, it seems amazing to me that, you know, the government's job is, well, in part to protect its national interests and to declare war when appropriate. And I have yet to hear any American politician seriously, or any well-known one, say, look, why don't we have a declaration of war against the Assad regime and go in, defeat him, and, you know, get out? But as Ed's saying, you know, there's this tendency to want to nation build afterwards, and in Syria, it just seems like that would not be possible given the current situation.
Flint, if Assad left today, what would happen in Syria? Anything different?
You know, I think that
no
the
one can
idea
actually
that the
predict
No, it's a hypothetical.
It's
a hypothetical. Right? Hypothetical. Flint, go ahead.
I think, you know, the idea that the opposition is going to form some coherent nationwide government in Syria is a delusion. You know, if Assad left, or if, you know, he surrendered Damascus, you would still have tens of thousands of men under arms supporting the Syrian government, who would be, controlling various parts of Syria. Among the opposition, you would have various regional, basically warlords emerge, controlling different parts of Syria. It would be chaos. It would be an incredibly sustained, violent situation. I also want to say on the point about U.S. motivations.
You're describing
for
the
this,
current situation.
The U.S. started supporting the Syrian opposition
as
a way of trying to push back against Iran.
Okay, that's what I was getting at. Ed, go ahead, jump in.
No, the description that Flint provides is the perfect description of what we're seeing at the moment. Two sides at loggerheads, complete chaos in the country, unwarranted and unlimited bloodshed across Syria. And I think Flint is right that the real issue here is Iran, and the real issue here is to...
Well, that's what it's all about. It's not about the Syrian people. It's not about democracy. It's about Iran. It's about Iran.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you. It started off, and it continues to be about Iran for those of us outside of the country, but I think inside the country, for 20 million plus Syrians, it's not about Iran, and it's about their freedoms, it's about them being butchered by Bashar al-Assad, and it's about the interference in their country now by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey, by Qatar, by Russia, by Iran, by Hezbollah. Those are the difficulties inside Syria, and that's the reason why Mu'adh al-Khatib wants to go via Russia, the US and Turkey to try and negotiate a settlement with Assad. But for as long as Assad is in power, he's not part of the solution. He continues to be part of the problem. Whether it's through Russia, through Iran, God forbid, or the backing from the Europeans and the US, Assad needs to step down. He needs to move aside. He can't be the force that holds the country together because he is now the cause that continues to divide this important country in the region. There are US national interests involved because there are US regional interests involved. Syria is not just Syria, which is a country contained. It shares borders with Jordan, with Israel, with Iraq, with Turkey. These are important allies. And the conflict in Syria is already spilling out into Lebanon, into Iraq, into Jordan, 200,000 plus refugees inside Turkey.
Flint,
but we've already seen that Turkey and Israel have addressed these issues.
We need more violence. We just need more violence. Matthew, go ahead, jump in.
My point is that Israel and Turkey have both already demonstrated that they are willing to address the spillover from the conflict. Well, that's all I wanted to say was that it seems that Turkey and Israel have both demonstrated that they are willing and able to deal with the spillover of the conflict. I still fail to recognize why U.S. interests are directly affected. Obviously, our allies might have issues with the spillover, but they seem perfectly capable of addressing it themselves so far.
Flint, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to get the U.S. perspective straight. I mean, the U.S. started supporting the opposition in Syria because the Obama administration calculated it was a way of pushing back against Iran, and that Assad's overthrow might even, in their calculations, spark the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. This was detached from reality, but it was an important part of the calculation in 2011 going into 2012. Then the administration begins to get spooked because of, let's call it, the Benghazi effect. I mean, the reality is the U.S. ambassador in Libya was almost certainly killed by groups that either the U.S. had armed and supported or that U.S. allies had armed and supported. So before an election, you don't want that kind of blowback. The administration backs away from Syria a bit. Now they're stepping back in because they think somehow they're going to be able to stage manage the balance of power between, jihadi and quote-unquote more moderate elements.
Fascinating discussion. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests today in New York and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Another shot at forced regime change. That's what it looks like. As Syria continues to experience collapse, the neighborhood is not being spared. What was a tragic domestic civil war is now becoming a regional conflict. Again, the law of unintended consequences appears to be in play. To crosstalk the Syrian civil war, I'm joined by Flint Leverett in Washington. He is a professor of international relations at Penn State University and co-author of the book Going to Tehran.
Stepping up its efforts to promote a political process. The Syrian government is ready to take part. Other important players, Iran, China, are backing a political process. But unfortunately, some of the supporters of the Syrian opposition, the United States, the Europeans, the Saudis, seem determined to intensify their armed support, their military support for the opposition. That's going to make it very hard to get serious diplomacy going, and it's going to keep the violence rolling along. To stop the violence, to put a lid on this, is through diplomacy aimed at a political settlement based on power sharing. The UN envoy, the Arab League envoy, Mr. Brahimi, is a potentially capable mediator for that kind of process. He initially resisted pressure to say that Assad had to go as the beginning of a political process, but he eventually succumbed to that pressure, and that's really reduced his potential effectiveness. Russia is trying
on why the United States must come to terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Also in Washington, we have Matthew Feeney. He is an assistant editor at Reason 24/7. And in New York, we cross to Ed Hussein. He is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Flint, Libya imploded. Is Syria exploding and taking the neighborhood with it?
The risks of that are certainly increasing. I've been saying for it seems like 2 years now that the only way...
Is it too late for diplomacy now?
No, not at all. We should give diplomacy every chance for as long as possible. And I think under the current circumstances,
but does the Syrian opposition want that?
Simply because...
But does the Syrian opposition want diplomacy?
We have the evidence to support the fact that Maarrit al-Khatib has gone out of his way, has upset his own rank and file and his own followers to open negotiations with a butcherous regime in Damascus. There's no two ways about it that this is a regime that's killed its own people, maimed its own people, and despite the fact that the Syrian National Council